In 376 AD, a rebellion broke out in Rome's provinces in the Balkans. Provoked by the heavy-handed rule of Roman officials, a large group of Goths who had recently migrated into the Eastern Roman Empire had revolted against imperial rule. After a year of fighting, the two sides faced off near the town of Salices, each hoping to bring the war to a swift conclusion. The Roman Empire first encountered the Goths during the 3rd century AD, clashing with tribes migrating from the north along the Danube on several occasions. The Gothic Wars of the 3rd century peaked during the reign of Claudius II, who won an overwhelming victory over the united tribes at Nisus in 268 AD, shattering their invasion of the Balkans. Over the following years, the Romans and Goths would settle into their new frontiers along the Danube, with wars periodically breaking out during the rest of the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. The relationship between the Romans and Goths, however, should not be characterized as simply two old enemies battering one another in war after war. The Romans managed to form good relationships with many groups of Goths, and a number of them migrated into the empire in search of new fortunes, and were known to serve well in the imperial army. During the 4th century AD, however, Rome would meet a new faction of Goths that, unbeknownst to her, would propel the empire into one of the bloodiest wars of late antiquity. During the late 4th century AD, a new power was rising from the plains of the steppe. The migrating Huns emerged from the east and caused great devastation to the barbarian tribes in their path, either conquering them outright or forcing them to flee towards the west. Athanaric, chieftain of the Gothic tribe known as the Tervingi, was one of the men in the latter category, and he decided to hunker down in the mountains north of the Danube. However, not all of the Gothic leaders accepted this strategy, and two chieftains named Fritigern and Alavivus decided to instead seek sanctuary in the Roman Empire, a move that conflicted with Athanaric's treaty with the Emperor Valens to not set foot within imperial territory. The Goths arrived at Rome's Danube frontier in 376 AD and set up camp just north of the river. There has been much debate over how many Goths eventually arrived there, and while we cannot be certain, it is clear that many thousands assembled near the Roman frontier, with the imperial troops stationed there having difficulty in keeping count of their numbers. The Goths sent envoys to the Emperor Valens asking to be settled inside Roman territory in exchange for providing soldiers to the military. The Romans agreed to these terms quite quickly, seeing the migrants as a useful source of recruits for the army. Having secured a deal to settle in Thrace, the Tervingi started to cross into Roman territory. Moving so many thousands of individuals across the Danube proved to be a difficult task. The Romans had a well-established process of accepting and settling migrants into the empire, but unfortunately for the Tervingi, the officials charged with overseeing the process handled the affair poorly. Negligence and corruption were evidently rampant among the Roman authorities, chief among them being Lupicinus, commander of the Comitatensis units stationed in Thrace, and Maximus, who commanded the Limitane frontier troops. Forced to deal with the corrupt Roman authorities and being low on supplies, the Goths grew increasingly agitated. The unrest escalated further when more Goths began crossing over the Danube, whilst Lupicinus' poor handling of the migration eventually provoked an open rebellion. The Romans hastily gathered a force to attack the Goths near Marcellinus, but Fritigern was already waiting for them, and the Goths quickly overwhelmed Lupicinus' column. Following this success, the Gothic army started to grow in strength considerably. A group of them near Adrianople cut apart a hastily gathered militia sent by the local magistrates and joined Fritigern, as did the Greuthungi and bands of Hunnic and Alan mercenaries. The Goths now began to raid the Thracian countryside, with the Romans not having enough troops in the area to properly contain this new threat. However, in the next year, 377 AD, the first major Roman response came, as reinforcements sent by Valens from the eastern frontier arrived. Veteran legions under the generals Profurutus and Trajan, who had been operating in Armenia against the Persians. These troops advanced into the mountainous territory of Thrace and inflicted a series of defeats on the Goths. However, the Tervingi and their allies continued to mount staunch resistance, and not every engagement went the Romans' way. Eventually, however, the Romans succeeded in driving the Goths back to the Danube and confronted them near the town of Salices. Fritigern had most of his men camped near the town inside a circle of wagons, where they were exultantly poring over the plunder they had gathered from last year's raiding. Profurutus and Trajan had also not been idle, and had recently linked up with reinforcements from the Western Roman Empire sent by the Emperor Gratian. These included troops from the Pannonian and Rhine frontiers under Frigeridus, as well as Gratian's own household unit under Ricomeres. With a confrontation seemingly on the horizon, Fritigern also recalled his raiding parties, concentrating the Goths' numbers. We know little about either of the opposing armies. According to Ammianus, the Roman army was outnumbered in this encounter, which likely consisted of a mixture of legionary and auxilia palatina units backed by cavalry. On the Gothic side, Fritigern would have had his own large corps of Gothic warriors, who were backed by Hunnic and Alan allies, likely drawn to their side by the prospect of plunder and winning glory in battle. The Romans initially planned to wait for the Goths to break camp, as they were constantly on the move, likely due to the difficulty of supplying such a large body of men in a single area. After this, they planned to attack the vulnerable rear of the Gothic column, eliminating them in one fell swoop. Unfortunately for the Romans, either because deserters had revealed their plans or the Goths had correctly predicted them, the enemy instead remained steadfastly in their camp. For a long time, the two sides engaged in a tense standoff, each watching their enemy for signs of vulnerability. After more Gothic raiding parties returned to their camp, however, their confidence increased greatly, and they began to prepare for battle. After passing the night under arms, both sides began to deploy in the morning. The Romans formed their infantry into the center in at least two lines, as was their normal practice, leaving a strong reserve to counter any enemy breakthroughs, while their cavalry guarded the flanks. The Goths adopted a similar formation, concentrating their infantry in the middle, while their cavalry, likely composed mostly of Huns and Alans, protected the flanks. The Goths had initially planned to seize a nearby hill, so that they could charge down at the Romans using their greater numbers and impetus to overwhelm them as they had at Marcianopolis. However, it was now the Romans who saw through the Gothic plans, and they began to rapidly advance in order to deny the enemy the advantage of the high ground. After these initial maneuvers, both sides started a general advance towards one another, each confident in success. The Romans started to chant the Battitus, a war cry adopted from the Germanic tribes, designed to intimidate their opponents with increasingly loud shouts. The Goths, for their part, began to hurl insults and their own war cries at the enemy, but neither side appears to have been intimidated by this display. To begin the battle, both sides started harassing the opposing lines with missiles, beginning with volleys of arrows and slingshots. At long range, these were unlikely to do serious damage, especially against well-organized bodies of infantry, but they could slow down the enemy's advance and cause some disorder. However, the closer the two sides got to each other, the more accurate and lethal their shots would be, and they would also come in range of their heavier short-range missiles, such as javelins. Here, the Romans would have likely had an advantage against the Goths, as each of their infantrymen was equipped with several heavy darts known as plumbatae, and often carried javelins in addition to this. However, neither side gained any advantage in the exchange of missiles. The battle would be decided in close quarters. The Romans and Goths advanced in good order, with shields tightly locked together, and fierce hand-to-hand fighting ensued. The Goths would have attempted to use their greater numbers and the ferocity of their charge to break through the Roman ranks, who in turn relied on their superior discipline and equipment to hold back the enemy. While the infantry fought on in the center, the cavalry hovered around the flanks of the formations, chasing down any fleeing enemies they could catch and trying to find openings to outflank their opponents. At first, the Roman line held firm. However, the Gothic right flank, the side of an army traditionally containing its best troops, was eventually able to overwhelm the Roman left. The Roman reserves now came into play, and launched a strong counterattack at the Goths now pouring through their left flank. This counterattack proved decisive, as it drove the Goths back and rescued the Roman infantry still fighting for their lives on that side, and stabilized the line. Although both armies were putting up fierce resistance, neither was able to turn the tide to their advantage. For the rest of the day, the Romans and Goths simply engaged in a brutal battle of attrition, with their lines locked firmly in place. The coming of nightfall, however, eventually convinced the two sides to begin retreating back to their own camps. The Battle of Salices had ended in a bloody draw. According to Ammianus, the Goths sustained heavier casualties, but the Romans were also badly bloodied. The night would now have to be spent treating the wounded as best they could, and planning for what the next day might bring them. On the day after the battle, both sides were exhausted and not ready to continue fighting. The Romans decided to withdraw from the area, returning to Marcellinus, while the Goths remained firmly within the relative safety of their wagon circle for 7 days. This gave the Romans valuable time to regroup and build several barricades in the mountains around Thrace, with the aim of containing the Goths within the most infertile parts of the area, where they would not be able to effectively supply their gathered army. Ricomeres also departed the Roman army for Gaul, aiming to raise more troops for the battles to come. Ultimately, the Battle of Salices would be the only major action fought by either side that year. The Romans had inflicted significant damage on the Goths and contained their invasion, but also had failed to decisively break their will and ability to fight. The following year, Valens took to the field in person and fought the Goths near Adrianople. However, he was disastrously defeated and killed. It was not until 383 AD that the two sides were finally able to negotiate a peace treaty, allowing the Goths to settle within Roman territory largely as Valens had originally desired. The precise details of these battles and the politics surrounding the Gothic War will, however, have to wait for another video.